Nuclear power has many great features. It has zero carbon emissions, baseload power available 24/7 with a high reliability, and it's not expensive when you spread the construction costs over the 60 to 80 years that a power plant typically lasts. But there are some downsides. Construction time is about 6 years, if not longer, and that's after years, maybe a decade, of site selection, financing, permitting, licensing, and arranging a grid connection. Is nuclear power required or even desirable to decarbonize our civilization? This was the question behind my last four videos covering nuclear waste, TerraPower's Natrium fast neutron reactor, Kairos's pebble bed small modular reactor, and Copenhagen Atomic's Thorium reactor. In this episode of Decarbonize, I'd like to pull back and ask the question, what role do I see for nuclear power in the next 20 years? We need to decarbonize our electrical grid quickly. We don't have until 2050 to do the easy stuff, and fixing our grid is easy stuff. The hard stuff, like aviation, will take longer, until 2050 and possibly beyond. But we have all of the tools to decarbonize our grid today, and nuclear is one of them. Spent nuclear fuel is an issue, but as I covered in this video, not as bad as most people think. The US is doing an okay job managing the waste, and one can look to countries like France and Finland as examples of the correct way of dealing with spent nuclear fuel. Public perception of safety is a concern, but actual safety isn't. Of the two nuclear disasters in countries that were doing it responsibly, the release of radiation was less than from a properly operating coal plant, and there were no direct deaths. Modern reactors are even safer, with passive features making a meltdown all but impossible. Looking over the last 40 years, we see an increase in the use of coal, which plateaued about 5 years ago, and an increase in the use of methane, which is continuing, a decrease in oil, and a dramatic increase in wind, solar, and bioenergy over the last 20 years. Nuclear power has barely budged since 1995, other than a visible dip in 2011 after the Fukushima accident. Let's start with an easy question. Shall we shut down functional, well-operating nuclear power plants? No. As I covered in my previous video, the waste is manageable, there's no CO2 emissions, and the cost to keep a nuclear power plant operating is low. But many nuclear plants were built when bell-bottom jeans and disco was in style. In the US, they were originally licensed for 40 years, and they got an extension for an additional 20 years, and are now, or soon will be, asking for a second extension of 20 years. Like John Travolta, they keep working, surprising those of us old enough to remember Welcome Back, Kotter. So can a nuclear power plant operate safely for 80 years? They have the unique challenge of exposure to neutrons, which weakens many materials. The reactor vessel is exposed to hot, pressurized water, and a leak would be catastrophic. But the operators have tools to detect and repair issues. We have a good understanding of how neutron exposure works, and I have confidence that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and its counterparts elsewhere will be asking the right questions and requiring a sufficient level of proof that the reactor is safe before granting an extension. But my guess is 80 years is all we're going to get out of these plants. We're even looking at restarting some nuclear plants. In Japan, nuclear power went from providing 33 gigawatts before the Fukushima event to only 11 gigawatts today. But most of those plants are still operable, and efforts are underway to reopen some of them. In the US, Constellation Energy has filed to restart 3 Mile Island Unit 1 after it shut down in 2019 for economic reasons. Microsoft has signed a power purchase agreement for all of the output of the 835 megawatt plant to power its data centers. Obviously, this gets a lot of attention since the reactor next door was 3 Mile Island Unit 2 that melted down in 1979. Germany has shut down all of their nuclear reactors, but could conceivably restart as many as 9 of them. Given that there's likely to be a new government coming in Germany and the war in Ukraine makes imports of cheap Russian methane unlikely for the foreseeable future, this is a possibility. But other than these examples, there isn't a lot of opportunity to restart nuclear power plants. So we're probably not shuttering a lot of reactors in the next 10 to 20 years, and we'll be turning a handful back on. But will we build more? In Sustainability by Numbers, Hannah Ritchie works out the average time of construction to be 6 to 8 years, with a few outliers like Vogtle in the US and Hinkley Point C in the UK. Japan, South Korea, and China are the fastest at 4, 5, and 6 years respectively. The US averages over 7 years for construction. In India, it's taken over 10 years on average. This is just construction time and doesn't count the years needed for site selection, permitting, and licensing. Unfortunately, she didn't have good numbers on those issues. By comparison, wind and solar facilities can be built in under a year. Again, we're not counting site selection and permitting, which can take a significant amount of time, especially for wind projects, but not as long as for a nuclear power plant. And construction time isn't just important for when you'll have the power for the grid, but it's important for the financials. Once you start construction, you're spending big bucks buying equipment and paying labor, and the longer construction takes, the more interest you have to pay on the money you borrowed to build the plant. 1 year of interest before you start getting revenue is vastly different than 7 years. Just 1 year of delay might cost $100 million for a large nuclear power plant. This doesn't mean that there will be no new nuclear plants. Between now and 2030, there are 65 gigawatts of new nuclear power scheduled to come online, about half of which are in China, followed by India, Turkey, Egypt, Russia, and the UK. Even Bangladesh is building a 2.4 gigawatts of nuclear power. For all the excitement of small modular reactors, fast neutrons, pebble beds, gas cooled, and other ideas to improve how to extract energy from splitting the atom, 96% of the energy will come from boring large pressurized water reactors. China, India, and Russia are all working on a fast neutron reactor. The TerraPower Natrium reactor didn't make it on the list, but if it did, it would feel at home with these small test reactors. In addition, China and Argentina are working on small modular pressurized water reactors, like the NuScale design that no one wants to build because it's too expensive. So for the rest of the decade, nuclear power means pressurized water reactors, and it primarily means China. So is 64 gigawatts a lot? Here's a chart from the International Energy Agency on how much renewables are expected to be installed over the same period of time, almost 6,000 gigawatts. Now, you can't compare directly since nuclear has a very high capacity factor, while wind and solar are much lower, around 25%. But 6,000 divided by 4 is 1,500 gigawatts. 20 times more renewables than nuclear power are going to be built. The nuclear power being deployed by 2030 is not significant when you compare it to wind, solar, and other renewables. And given my review of Natrium, Kairos, and Copenhagen Atomics, I don't think any of the new technologies are so much better than pressurized water reactors as to fundamentally change the situation. They have advantages, but to replace an entrenched technology, you need to be much better. And these advances are somewhat better. At the same time, solar technology is improving. Floating wind turbines for deep ocean waters are being towed out to sea, and batteries are dropping in price about as quickly as any technology ever has. So the gap between nuclear and renewables is growing. As I talked about in this video, it is possible to build an affordable, reliable electrical grid based on renewables, storage, and long-distance transmission. But some nuclear power plants in the mix make it easier, especially in areas like the southeastern US with poor wind resources. There are things we can and should do to support the nuclear industry, like regulations that are safety focused without assuming a large pressurized water reactor. NuScale spent $500 million getting their small modular reactor licensed, and I'm sure that could have been done much less expensively without compromising safety. There are countries where renewables aren't as good an option, like Russia, where nuclear may continue to play a role. I see no reason to be optimistic about the nuclear industry. I'm not saying it's going away, but I wouldn't be surprised to see nuclear continue to deploy 10 gigawatts a year in a world where there are 1,000 gigawatts of renewables being deployed. There's a problem that keeps nuclear from being as big a part of the energy transition as wind and solar. The plants are complex, expensive, and time consuming to build. There is no new technology that is likely to disrupt that dynamic. Companies like NuScale and Copenhagen Atomics promise to bring mass production to nuclear, but the industry has a track record of promising too cheap to meter and delivering cost overruns and delayed projects. To be clear, I'm not saying we shouldn't build nuclear power plants. I'm saying I don't think we will, at least not in significant numbers. If you think the future of nuclear is rosy, please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you got to this point, you must have enjoyed the video, so please like and subscribe. And you can support the channel by buying me a Guinness. Click here to see my entire series on nuclear power. And please share this video with anyone you know who thinks nuclear power is required to decarbonize the grid.